Ben's worked for a long time in the industry. He's an expert in VDC processes and the use of 3D modeling. He also has a UK background, but he's operating here in Canada. And he looks after integration in systems and I'm sure VDC and BIM and all this subject matter for Aecon. So I'll invite him to come in anytime here. There he is, Ben. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. How you doing?
Yeah, good. How did I do with my introduction?
Perfect.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear. So you're going to talk to us about using this standard from a construction standpoint.
Yep.
Really looking forward to that, and I'll get out of your way.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Thomas said, I look after the BIM and digital construction processes within Aecon, primarily in infrastructure in our Civil East division. And what I'm going to go over today is where we try to implement ISO 19650 on one of our big major projects. This was an Aecon only project, and we started the journey about 3 years ago when I joined Aecon. And I'm going to take you through what we did and how we implemented, some of the benefits we got from that. And I'm also going to just touch on some of the critical challenges I see in the North American market, which may be putting a blocker on ISO 19650 implementation across the board. So I'm just going to kick off now. Okay. So there's one thing you might know is we coined the term integrated digital delivery rather than the term BIM. Now there's a couple of reasons around that. BIM in this market tends to be seen as a tool thing or a software thing, and we all know, what I'm referring to. I'm referring to Autodesk and how they refer to the term BIM. So there's a challenge there. How do we communicate to our teams and our projects and our company what this is? And for me, it's that key word is that first word, integrated, integration. And if you look at ISO 19650, that's what it's all about, okay? Integration from start to end, all the way from feasibility study, all the way through to operations maintenance, okay? And that's what we're trying to do, and it's at the core of everything we do. And I highlighted a couple of words on this slide just to show that: process and tools, digital project information management, and increased productivity, quality, and risk management. And our approach, I'll be honest, is very much focused on making money and doing this as efficiently as possible and handing information over to our customers in the best possible way, in the highest quality. And that's what IDD is primarily about. So that's what I implemented when we first joined. And there was a couple of people that I brought into the team, and I just want to highlight Daryl, the CCO, who led the Gardner Expressway project, who's done a fantastic job of our first IDD project. And I'm going to take you through the processes that we set up and what Daryl implemented. So as you can see, we did set a minimum standard, and this minimum standard is now entirely across the business. And what it's about is developing that design in 3D in a ISO 19650 environment. That is very, very important. And that's something that we're pushing designers to do. I just want to touch on, this was actually a build only project. And that's why I think it's interesting for ISO, because you don't necessarily have to do BIM on design and builds, right? You can do this on build only. And a lot of interesting things come out of this, that we discovered some issues with the design that we received when we actually started to put it through the process, and issues with the information and how we received it. We had different versions of design given to us throughout, as part of our procurement package that weren't necessarily linked together. And these are the things that we found just by implementing, the standard processes around that. And obviously, being a contractor, we did do a schedule analysis. So we hooked everything to the schedule, and obviously cost analysis as well. And one of the biggest outputs of this project, and it's a lesson learned, is cost and schedule integration is critical, and overall data integration, having structured data, critical to the entire process to work. And you know, internally we've taken this and we moved it on to future projects, and now we use the term project breakdown structure, where, you know, our design, construction, commercial, procurement all follow that structure, and that is one of the big changes, and it's allowed us to build that structured data so it can all integrate. So I want to touch on the common data environment. So currently I am of the opinion there's not one system that does it all, particularly in the infrastructure world that I deal with. Linear assets, it's a big piece. So primarily our two systems that we used on this project were BIM 360 and Aecon. So we ultimately use BIM 360, and I'll touch on the structure in a minute, but we ultimately used it to manage our digital information. I call it engineering data management, and that's a coin I turned from the UK, where, you know, it's well-known term. And then we have Aecon, which did the ultimate project control. And before I joined Aecon, you know, the whole information management piece was not as highly seen as what it is now, and where it's got to, and that's because of the proven value through this process that we've achieved. And GIS is ultimately a tool we're bringing into infrastructure that allows us to map all this information. Now, one thing that all these, so it looks like a lot of systems, and I get that a lot, but the biggest thing is they all follow the same data structure, they all follow the same naming conventions, they all follow the same metadata tags, so information flows between them. And we use the ISO 19650 work in progress, shared, published, archive workflows to manage that process. And that's how the systems come together, is through the data and the structure of that data. So you'll see me, I'm using that term structured data a lot. So important. And then in terms of our common data environment setup, we had the work in progress area, shared, published, archived. One thing that I'm finding here, and I'm hopefully I'm bringing to the market, is around, now at the time this was 2018, so I used the term suitability code, now status code obviously within the ISO, but that is critical. Okay, it's not just critical at file level, it's also critical when you're in the 3D space at asset and object level, 100%. And I've just put a link there how our structure worked and how we used the coding on the information through that process. So just take you through that. Obviously, when it's work in progress, we had the S0 suitability code. And for coordination information review process, when the information was shared, we used a S1 to S4 process. And then when we got to publish, that's when, you know, we issued to the client, and when a file got formally signed, it was issued for construction or partial sign off, where things might not necessarily have been signed off fully, but we could cloud that on a drawing, or we can identify that in the model. And then obviously when we get to archive, that's where, you know, in the as-built process and for handover. Now, we didn't just use this on models, we used it on models, drawings, it was part of documentation, and it was also very interesting. I'm going to touch on this later. We actually used this way of working on managing of our point cloud data and our survey information as well. So this all follows the same coding, and we ensure the models are coded with this for a number of reasons. We use it to our advantage for schedule and cost, so we know what can be estimated from and what can be, you know, relied upon. And we also use it when we're federating information, right? And we know, you know, what may change and what might not change and what has changed. So that's a big piece. So I think it's the forgotten part of ISO, and I think it's particularly in the construction process is probably the most important piece, is that suitability and status coding. So I am of the opinion, as much as I need the client to give me the requirements, I can still do this, and I can still do this to the benefit of Aecon. So although we didn't have any BIM requirements on this particular contract, we did have a CAD standard, we did have a survey standard, and we did have a document control procedure to work to. So we ultimately pulled that all together and we built our exchange information requirements. And we used this to feed to our supply chain. So we was working very closely with an engineer who was doing the detailed engineering for particularly the steel girders and the fabrication aspect. And we put this in their contract and we ensured that the information they provided us followed their agreed requirements. So we touched on the system that we're using and how we're going to manage that common data environment and the workflow I showed earlier with the coding. We defined the numbering system and we based that on ISO 19650. We defined the coding and all of the sharing process, LOD, the CAD requirements, and we also had a process for master information delivery plan. So internally, we have a master information delivery plan, and we ask our supply chain to give us task information delivery plans. So essentially, when they give us a deliverable, it's in that format and it tells us what they've provided. We feed that into the master and we look at planned dates versus actual delivery dates. And we also ask the supplier to nominate a task information manager, so the person who's responsible for ensuring the information comes in accordance with these exchange information requirements. So that's what we added to our contract. Let's go to the next one. So that's, you know, where we get with the ISO and the key things to make a project work and make flow work. I mean, I'm such a firm believer in keeping it simple. And I like to coin the term practical BIM. And some of my VPs I work with, they very much use the term practical BIM. And what we mean by that is it can get very complicated for senior managers, you know, middle managers very quickly unless it's communicated in a certain way. So what we did internally on this particular project, and this has led the template, is we defined our areas of IDD. So what areas do we want to attack? Okay, and looking at the areas, where does that meet our contract requirements, and how's it going to benefit the project? So that's what we did. So we broke it down into these areas, and on this project we decided, well, we needed a common data environment, and by the way, that's a mandatory Aecon thing now. We need to do 3D modeling because that ultimately adds huge benefit to the project. We need to do the validation and coordination of that with survey, and we need to look at our planning and logistics. And then as built, you know, we need to be capturing the as built as we go and handing that over. And, you know, let's use our analytics tools to analyze that and and in the field, you know, capture where we are and what status we're at, using all those status suitability codes, right? So that's how we did it. So you know, these are the areas. This went to the project director, and I said, "Hey, project director, this is the area. These are the benefits you're going to get from that. Oh, by the way, we're compliant with ISO 9650. You know, it's early to the market at the time, and you know, we're going to be one of the first projects in North America to really push this. And here's where we're helping you with the risk. You know, we had some risk around the validation of the information, and you know, how are we going to consistently check, and how do we link that to quality and close out non-conformances, and that was, you know, and that's where the quality and compliance come in. And we identified the key people who are responsible for this particular area. So obviously I'm not going to go over every area, I just pulled out the first one, but you can see the template we used, and that really helped the project director understand what he's getting from this, and ultimately why he's agreeing to do that. Because I firmly believe if the project director does not buy in, you have got absolutely zero hope of implementing this process. So that was critical to enabling us to do this on this project. The next step was, okay, I've got my exchange information requirements that I've built based on the client. I've agreed with the project director, this is how we're going to tackle that. Next step is, if I'm to be compliant, I need to build our BIM execution plan. Now, because this was a build only project, we used the term 3D digital construction execution plan. And within that, we built all of our processes for managing all the information, identified a RACI matrix, who's responsible, accountable, consulted and informed based on the agreed activities that were linked to those areas that I showed you previously. So that was how we produced that implementation. And that was more, I'd call this document more the field level. It's the standard operating procedure, and everyone got a view of that. And mainly the engineering company and our survey group and others were involved with the development of that document. So I've stolen this actually from one of our VP operations, and he went, "Hey Ben, this is 3D control," and I said, "That's a brilliant way to term what we're doing here." So yeah, so that's what we're doing, is we are bringing the model and the common data environment at the center, and we're calling that 3D control. And what's feeding that is our received design or our consultant's design, our suppliers information, shop fitting drawings, product data specifications, and our survey requirements are also feeding. So it comes into this one environment, and that's how we do all of our core validation and verification. And also it's important that when you're in the middle of implementing on a project or business-wide strategy, you understand your company's key objectives and where does this support that. And I very much think putting this at the core, having good structured data and information management, making it better information management, having it there really embraces, embrace project complexity and ensure continuous risk management throughout the project, which is one of our key focus areas internally. So that's, what we did. And we demonstrated some of the benefits of doing this, okay, and what we got from that. So I'm going to take you through a couple of these benefits, and then I'm going to touch on the challenges. So the biggest one, I know we all know this, and I might be teaching everyone what they already know, but I really think it's important. Change management. Even when I was in the UK, it's one of the biggest challenges we have as a contractor. How do we manage the design? How do we manage consistent change from all parties, supply chain, design house, client? How do we manage these changes? And really having the workflow and the status coding allowed us to have the data structured in a way that allowed us to bring it together and identify the changes. And that was extremely critical. Without the coding, without the workflow, we would have just been throwing information together and we would have been guessing what it is. So that really allowed us to then push out our reports and analyze any change. And we couldn't have done it without that coding. And again, on the schedule impact and looking at lean and how we can support lean, one of the interesting tasks we did was we looked at, the process here. So just to give you a bit of background on how this was constructed, on the Gardner Expressway, it was a bridge rehabilitation project, a kilometre-long stretch, and we was essentially replacing the deck, removing the existing deck and putting a new deck on, and we was doing that through prefabrication. And we was essentially having girders arrive to a prefabrication site, and we was putting in the all the formwork and basically pouring the concrete, and then we were storing them in the yard before they went up. We actually used optimized 4D simulation to identify when the schedule was going to be impacted in terms of too much inventory in the yard and we need to move quicker on the deck. So how can we make this a 24-hour operation? So that's a process we went through. And again, having the coding aligned to the schedule, critical, and actually defining the level of development that we modeled to. So we took this to about 350, 400 level of development, and that really helped drive what was seen against the schedule and what could be seen against each of the activities, so we could identify that. So that was one of the critical pieces there. The other thing I'm going to touch on is we then looked at how do we track actual versus planned. So this was, as I said, we're managing these prefabricated objects. Where are they in that process? So we had that linked to our control systems and our ERP. And Uniclass was a critical piece of the jigsaw. So we applied Uniclass classifications to the objects, and we linked that Uniclass classification to the activity and to the cost item, and that allowed us to track that through there. So that was one of the uses of the classification code. And then for handover piece, we could link that classification to the product data specification, so it give us that handover pack. So that was one of the elements that was pushed through. And then the next thing was around, I mentioned earlier about the management of information. Well, everyone focuses on design data, but what about all this other stuff? And when I talk about other stuff, LiDAR and point cloud data. So we had it set up in the field that when the girder would arrive, we would actually scan that girder. Then we'd bring it into our system and we would validate that and check it. And we would produce a report off the back. That report would get a status coding, and it would get a revision and a number. And the data itself would get pushed into our BIM 360 and Aconex environment. So if the supplier is delivering the scan, they put it into Aconex, and that was given a status, suitability, and a name and a numbering system. So it could be tracked all the way through, and this data is quite interesting use of it. And we found it helped because you get a lot of times you might get scans that overlap, you might get multiple sets of data because one wasn't quite right and the other. It allowed us to revise that data and keep track of that change. Traditionally, we would have it on a hard drive and just hand it around the office, and two people have got different versions of that scan. Really good. And we could analyze for all sorts of things here. So I'm not going to touch on the technical. I could get into this really deeply, but maybe for another time we can touch on scan to BIM and how that might work, because I think this is extremely interesting, particularly when you're looking at prefabrication. And again, is how do we visualize that and how do we connect that back to schedule? And that's where our dashboarded and analytics come in. And critical, you see here, we actually, if we don't name things, we can't connect it properly. And this is just a quick one to show you have to have that classification in there to help you track that. And then the validation, I still believe in producing a good drawing that comes from that data set, that's easy to understand, that's coded properly, that has everything it needs to be within that system in the right part of the workflow and fed to the right people as per the RACI matrix. So that's, that really helped. It helped us build the handover package as we went, and that allowed us to really close out some non-conformances really quickly. And that was really, really powerful for the project team. So really, we went through this for a year, and when we implemented IDD and the ISO, we didn't want to scare people with this new ISO standard. So we just made sure it was at the core of what we did. And for us as a contractor, biggest thing, change management all the way through. And that's what we try and do. And now this has grown. So we've now applying this process across about 15 projects in Aecon, in different sectors, water, infrastructure, nuclear, and our UTS, urban transportation systems. It's all across there now on the big complex projects. And we're taking it further into the concessions piece of O&M and hand over to O&M because we have that as part of our business. So that's where we're growing. But as we grow, these are the three big challenges I'm finding. Particularly, this is probably more related to Ontario and Quebec more than anywhere else, because that's where the bulk of our work is at this stage, although I am seeing it in Winnipeg at the moment, is the commercial models. So what I mean by that is I think the commercial models in North America is very old school contracting. It's very blame culture orientated, lacks the collaboration required. And when you're adopting a process like ISO 19650, collaboration is key. Coming from the UK, they had the NEC4 commercial model, which allowed for, early warnings and early risk management and piece like that. And BIM really supported that process before I left, and I saw that happening here. It's very much, we got a problem, let's write a letter and let's see you in court type approach. And I shouldn't really say that, but that's just my third eye view of the world. May not necessarily be 100% correct, and we do as a company try and be more collaborative, but this is just a general statement. That's how the commercial model is built. It's not people problem, it's more of how that's structured to enable this. The other aspect is designer, supply chain and client capabilities in the market, even us as our capability, but we're growing it as a contractor. And this is my general comment, and I'm going to say it as a contractor. I generally believe around the world, this is being driven by tier one contractors, not driven by clients enough, and not driven by designers. And that is one of our biggest challenge. And our supply chain need a lot of help. So that's what I'm seeing. And I know you got some designers coming later that I've worked with, and they might tell you that I'm pushing them hard, but that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make the change from the tier one level. And then my third biggest challenge is the available resources in the market. It's the education. The team we've built, we very much had to go for the strategy of bringing in coordinators and technicians, and who are not necessarily understanding of BIM. They know how to do 3D modeling and produce drawings, but they don't necessarily understand the process, and we've had to teach that as we go. So I know there's BIM master courses, I know there's BIM PhDs and things, but it's very much focused around 3D models, not focused around ISO 19650, which it needs to be. So there's that aspect, and then there's also the aspect of industry-wide education, but that's where obviously BIM and events like this really help. And it's fantastic to see that, and it's fantastic to be part of that, because ultimately that's what we want to go. So that's where we are. I hope you found that interesting. And obviously hand over for any questions.
I muted myself, just figured it out. Ben, thanks so much. That was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Lots to talk about. I'm from a construction background as well, so I'll jump on the bandwagon and say it's all the designer's fault, everything that's happening. Just kidding. But it is I do agree with your statement in that a lot of this stuff, BIM included overall, maybe I'm going to catch hell for saying this, but I do think that the general contractors carry the biggest risk profile in the industry. So, where there's risk, there's reward, right? So there's an incentive to improve, and there's an incentive to introduce new technologies and standards. So from my perspective as well, I do think it is the bigger general contractors, tier one general contractors, that are driving these standards, which kind of leads to the question of, how can we bring these small to medium-sized enterprises up as well in this? And, a lot of the suppliers that Aecon works with are the same suppliers that Bird and Elliston and PCL work with. And these are all small to medium-sized enterprises. So from your perspective, what are you doing as a company to help smaller general contractors understand these new things that are coming down the pipe and ramp up their game so that they can be a better supplier to you guys?
So it's that collaboration piece, right, Thomas? So one of the processes we do with our procurement team is we do supply chain capability assessment. So we send it out to the market and to our suppliers and say, hey, what can you do? What are you capable of? And actually, some of the responses actually surprise us. They do a lot. They just don't share with us.
Right.
So we open a dialogue and say, hey, share that. Can you share that with us? And there's put your hands up. But then we have the conversation and we take through that. And others, they're just not there.
Right.
And sometimes they don't need to be, right? They're one man in a van. Like, that's what they are. So what we do in that case is we, on the construction side, resource up to allow us to get their information. We'll give them spreadsheets and things to fill out, and then we'll take that in, and then we will push it in for them on their behalf, and we'll build a process around that. So it is working hand in hand. And I must say, on that side, even on the designer side as well, recently with some of the big designers that we work with and the medium-sized designers that we work with, we're doing a lot more collaboration and a lot more talking. And we're talking about what's the Aecon way look like. So that's how we're trying to do it. Look, when I started this journey and I come here, I did say this is a 10 to 15 year journey. This isn't 1 year and you're doing BIM across your entire organization. This is 10 to 15 years, and it's going to take that long. And but this is where obviously I think events like this are seriously important to get the message out.
So how have you found that, like culture is usually the hardest challenge, and companies operate different ways, but do you find that Aecon is a very open culture where they want to drive these types of standards? And is John Beck saying, hey, this is important to the whole business and getting everyone on board, or do you find that it's still a bit of a slugfest internally with changing the culture?
So culturally, in Aecon, it's a very innovative company. It always looks forward, and I'm going to say this, out of all the GCs I've worked for, this is the one in terms of driving innovation and digital. I come from two worlds, right? So I come from the UK where it was very restricted, actually. And you know what? I think BIM's become what is in the contract, I'll tick it off requirement, and what's not benefit to us. Now gone the opposite, where it just doesn't exist. So now I've got to focus it on what are the business goals and what's the best way of doing it for Aecon and in this market. So that's actually allowed me to innovate more. So what I've very much heavily realized in my experience is getting that middle ground and that middle balance between following the rule books step by step, and also what is the requirement to deliver. And because I think we're trying that approach, I'm finding the buy-in a lot easier. And communicating to people, how does this benefit you, really helps. But that middle management is always our biggest challenge. It's that project manager level. Right. And I touched on before, project director, project manager, without that buy-in, you're not going to get leverage. And there are areas in the business I struggle because they just do not believe in this way of working. So our focus, that's why our focus has always been one project at a time, prove its value and grow organically, rather than you must do. And that's how we've done it.
So it sounds, I mean, you're coming from the UK, which I think you could fit the UK inside of southwestern Ontario, maybe. And there's 65 million people there. We have like 38 million people here over an enormous geography with lots of very disconnected markets that operate at different levels of sophistication just because the volumes change, right? So kind of different operating environment for sure. And you mentioned how, culturally there's kind of like, some projects still have the sort of like blame culture where it's very adversarial and whatnot. And, certainly Aecon's a giant company. You're dealing with probably lump sum projects. You're dealing with P3 projects where there's a high level of collaboration. So I just want to chat about that a little bit. Do you find that the contract type or the geography, the city, the sub-economy within Canada has a big effect on how collaborative the partners are on a particular project?
Yeah, 100%. So each province is very different for us. So Ontario, where I talked about that's more of an Ontario thing, I'll be honest, is around the way the contract models are in Ontario. Sure. But we're seeing change in that. So recent bids that we're going, there's a huge shift, and I'm seeing that shift and much more openness. So that's great.
Do you find, just to add to the question, but do you find there's a difference? I mean, you do a lot of civil work. I think you're probably 50-50. I'm not sure, but you do a lot of heavy civil work. You do a lot of commercial ICI work. Do you find that? I mean, civil is kind of a different animal as it relates to using 3D technologies. Do you find that the culture is different between civil jobs and building projects?
Yeah, there's a very different culture. The building side, or let's say the nuclear side of things, if we go there, that's much more structured. So actually the implementation of this is a lot easier because it has that structured approach. It has to be, right? Very security driven. And it's very similar in the water sector, where infrastructure is a bit more open and a bit more open to interpretation. So that's the big difference I see. So yeah, and as I said, you had the provinces in Quebec is much more advanced in this. They've adopted British standards a lot earlier, and they're probably 3 or 4 years further ahead in the journey. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. It's like working across Europe. Let's be honest. So I worked in the UK. Each province is its own way of implementation and its own contracting model.
So with the civil work that you're doing, there was a question that came up earlier. Are you applying the standard to civil projects the same way that you would building projects? I guess your example was the gardeners, so the answer is probably yes, but maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yep, civil infrastructure is probably the leading light in the implementation. So it's where we're implementing first. Buildings were doing it to an extent, to a certain level. They just wasn't necessarily leveraging the benefits in construction phase. And that's what we're doing more on the building side, is leveraging what the designers have done, and the stuff I showed you, that's now being leveraged and handed over. But before I come, it was just being done at designer level in the building sector.
So, you're coming from, your experience in the UK with the level 2 standard and how that morphed and became this ISO standard. Did you find through that transition that the industry was sort of like, hey, great, a standard, or were they sort of like, man, we do things a certain way, we don't need this? Like, what was the acceptance like in the UK, and has it completely, are every job in the UK right now is using this standard, or is it like still like 10% like it might be here?
So I'm just gonna plug a little bit. I'm gonna plug the UK BIM Alliance and the work that's being done over there. So initially it was a government initiative, and I know you've got Paul on later, and he'll probably touch on this a lot more. But there was a UK government initiative by 2016. All government funded projects must be BIM level 2 compliant.
Right. Yep.
There was now 2016 come and the world didn't change. Everything happened the same way. But the difference was it was in the contract, right?
Right.
So it's in that contract. You got no choice. You're doing this, and the client's saying to us, we're going to take that information. The issue we had is very much the buy-in at project level and the buy-in from the industry itself.
Right.
And how to meet this standard. They were still treating it as a box tick exercise on a contract rather than truly embracing it. And that's when the UK BIM Alliance was formed, and that's industry led now. So now they're on the second part of the journey. It's been government led, it's now been handed over to industry, and they're doing a lot with educating the industry and supporting the industry of implementation. So from my experience, there needs to be that organization or a collective of organizations that are trying to help throughout the entire process. It's not just government.
Do you know if, is there a lot of statistical information around measuring the impact of the use of this standard on the UK market? What's as work on the ground from a productivity standpoint, putting work in place, has that improved, or has the amount of time it takes to get through the design coordination process, has that improved? Are they measuring the impact of the use of this standard well?
I wouldn't necessarily agree they are. There's they have the BIM survey they do on a yearly basis, and they gather the data on that. And there's a lot around the Digital Built Britain piece where they're doing a lot of analysis of it. It's a difficult one to answer, is the benefits, right? And that's internally in Aecon, I was asked to do a benefits analysis. Of course. And how do I do that? And I looked at avoided rework, avoided cost. That was the only way. So you might think the design process is taking longer, but the build process is probably speeding up. That's what's probably happening, but it's not necessarily being fully measured yet at that level.
So it's sort of, I don't want to conflate too much the use of BIM and setting up processes related to that and the ISO document, because the industry has for a long time used BIM and had these discussions around creating execution plans, et cetera. So it sounds to me, and that's always been a challenge, going within a business saying, okay, we want to collaborate up front and proactively coordinate using BIM, and this is the value proposition, and you can probably measure that. but then standardizing how that information gets generated and how you're going to communicate around that information is sort of like next level, right? And also saying you're going to go through a specific framework. So it gets even a little, it's like another layer of implementation that you have to kind of justify. But I mean, that's kind of why we wanted to have this open discussion with the group. And I'm hoping we're going to get to it in the panel a little bit, a bit of a debate about, you know, is it really, do we want to create an environment where we have to go through a standardized process to establish these things? And will it actually have an effect on the ground? Or are we better off to have an environment where, you know, there's innovation, right? Because standards sometimes can be the antithesis of innovation, right? How can you improve if you have to follow a particular way of doing something? So what are your thoughts on that?
So it's the viewer standards as well, right? So, and I went through a BSI kite mark with Skanska. So for everyone's knowledge, what a kite mark is you're audited against a certain standard, and it's based on your application. It's not based on your ticking the boxes. Okay. And I went through it with Skanska in the UK. And actually what I learned through going through the kite mark, it doesn't mean you have to follow it's your application of what that is telling you is very important. And the ISO, and I think that's communicated in the UK, is you don't have to follow the ISO line by line, word by word. It's the ethos that you should be following.
Right.
So in some respects, I think there needs to be a guidance there, but I don't think the guidance needs to be a 50-page, and detail out the process. It needs to say you should have these things in place. Yeah. How you achieve these goals is down to how you're delivering the project or the asset or whatever. But that's, you know, that's
what I can with that. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll just wrap it up there because we're kind of hitting the end of our time here. But that was a great presentation, Ben. Really appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure that you'd be willing to have chats with people you know, after this event wraps up. So yeah, great. And you know, looking forward to the discussion. We are going to take a bit of a break here for, I think, just 2 minutes. Just an opportunity for everyone to kind of stretch their legs before we get into the next presentation with I believe it's Alex from WSP. So Ben, thank you very much. And
thank you.
We'll see everybody after a short break.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks.